The idea today that I'd like to explore is by looking at, I'm going to get this hooked up in another 10 minutes. There we go. By looking at medieval art in a certain light and asking certain kinds of questions which we have not historically asked of this material, we may find that it tells us a very different story from the one that we customarily think it tells us when we walk inside a building and look at a medieval church, or go look at an illuminated manuscript, or study an icon. Indeed, I was first drawn to the study of medieval art precisely because I really couldn't stand it. I loved art history, and I was taking survey of art, and everything was interesting except this stuff. And then I had a teacher who turned the lights on for me, who showed me what this was really all about. And it provided then a revelatory form of access to a society that seemed so alien to me that it ignited my scholarly life ever since. And so I want to talk a little bit about that journey and how one thinks about this material. The ground rules are simple. I'm going to talk about these things. Please feel free to interrupt me at any time. This is not one of those sit quietly for 87 minutes and then we're going to have 3 minutes of interaction. If you have a question or a thought or an observation or a criticism, just let me know. I will not become unhorsed by that, and it also reminds me that you're actually listening. When you're up here doing this thing and people are all just looking at you, they could be somewhere else and you have no way of knowing. So I much appreciate it and welcome that. I wanted to begin by looking at two works of art that are familiar probably to many of you. We are looking now at the west facade of the Church of San Marco in Venice. I might begin by asking, how many of you have ever been there? Wow, that's really good. So we begin by talking about, the first section of my talk is to talk a little bit about what I would call the language of medieval art. At some level, admittedly, this is a very distinctive church. This one isn't like, say, Gothic French buildings. But the basic format of these structures and the design on them is a lot like every other building, except when one starts to look closely at these things. So when we look at the facade of San Marco in Venice, we see a structure that is designed to emulate the great achievements of Byzantine architecture, though it was built by non-Byzantines. These were Italian merchants, these were the Venetians, who were seeking to build their own empire. And in so doing, in emulating the architecture of another culture, they were saying something very clear about who they are. We are on our way to surpass the Byzantines as the foremost Christian culture in the world. That's what this building really is intended to say. I don't mean to suggest for a moment that it isn't also about religious subjects. It is about religious subjects. But I have to tell you, most of the images we're going to look at today, the religious content of these images is only one of many, many meanings that we can discern if we ask the right questions. If we look closely at this facade, and indeed I'm not sure that this particular image helps us completely, but these columns that adorn the sides of the portals entering the building are almost all stolen from monuments that were taken in the Holy Land when the Venetians, or rather in Constantinople, when the Venetians redirected their great crusade to liberate the Holy Land and instead went to Constantinople and pillaged and murdered their fellow Christians and brought back to this place a whole host of monuments that show, effectively present themselves as trophies of victory over the other preeminent Christian kingdom in the world. And if you're sitting in Piazza San Marco having a drink, listening to the violin player who's right about over here, you who have been there, you know what I'm talking about. Look at this, and it really provides us with extraordinary access to that subject. The quadriga, not a great slide, but you know the four horses that stick their heads up here? Same thing. They were taken from Constantinople as victory monuments. And so, move forward several hundred years, when Napoleon conquered Venice, he took those horses back to Paris for the same reason, to place them in Paris and to show he has conquered the Venetian Empire. So art can very often tell us a great deal more than we think it can. This is not just a church with a lot of pretty decoration.
Well, how did the horses get back?
After Napoleon's demise, it was agreed by the French that they would be repatriated, they would be returned, because they were seen by the Venetians to be, even though they were stolen and that's whatever, nonetheless central to their identity, and it had been stripped from them, as the Statue of Liberty would be to us, even though it was a gift from somewhere else. Imagine someone comes and takes that. Yeah.
Were the copies in place before they returned, or
the copies that are there now? Yeah, those copies were put up 30 years ago. So the originals were up for a long, long time until they were increasingly damaged in the open air and pollution, mostly from boats. So the interior of San Marco has a bewildering array of images as well. And one goes inside. one is overwhelmed by the number of religious images all over the building. And I'm not going to spend lots of time talking about that today. It isn't my subject per se, except to say that here, too, there are several themes of importance. One, many of the mosaics inside this building were made by Byzantine artisans that they hired. They brought them in because the Byzantines are really the best at making Byzantine art, and that was what they were seeking to emulate. They intended and indeed achieved a decorative program inside this building that was the most extensive work of mosaic decoration in the history of the Middle Ages. So there was a wow factor, just as today. All of you go in this building and you walk in and you look up, you're like, wow, this is amazing. That's exactly the sentiment they were seeking to accomplish back in the 13th century as well. But there's more. If one looks closely at these images, we can learn even more about this theme. In the narthex, the entry porch of the Church of San Marco. So you go in those great big front doors, and there is a closed-in porch area that is sometimes flooded. Last time I was there, we were up to our ankles in water on the way in. Up on the ceiling are smaller domes, of which this is one, that are decorated with mosaics. Here we see in this dome a series of images from the first chapters of the Old Testament, showing the creation of the world. So you have Adam and Eve being introduced into paradise. Can we turn these lights off now? Maybe we can see a little bit better. If I turn them off, you have to promise not to go to sleep, though. Okay. This is an extraordinary narrative sequence of images from the Old Testament, starting with the beginning and the spirit above the waters and the creation of dry land and the creation of Adam and Eve, and there we go, all the way here to the naming of the animals and the eventually culminating in the expulsion from paradise. Why is this here? Is it simply to show people who go into this building biblical images? Yes, in part. But the other reason is that these images, and this was discovered 40 years ago, 50 years ago, only in the last several generations. These images were taken from one of the most famous illuminated manuscripts made in the history of the Byzantine Empire, which was stolen from Constantinople when the Crusaders went there in 1204. So imagine how this works. They brought back all these columns and sculptures in the quadriga, and they put them in the building. They also brought back this book of extraordinary importance and value that looks a little bit like this. It was the most extensive illuminated book of Genesis that had ever been created since the time of Christ. Very valuable, important. It was in the property of the Byzantine emperor throughout the period of the Byzantine Empire. They stole it, they brought it back, and what do you do with it? It's a little book. You could go around and show people to it, or you could put it up in this way as a monument to the fact that they possess this great book. The book was then eventually collected. It found its way into the market, and it was collected by Sir Robert Cotton in London, who was a great, great manuscript collector, which initially provided the collection of the British Library. His gift is what formed the British Library. The treasure of his collection was this great Genesis manuscript. And while it was, I think, in the British Library, there was a terrible fire, and the manuscript was virtually destroyed. And it now exists in 2 shoeboxes of charred fragments. The only way we have been able to understand all of the images in that book is by looking at secondary reflections of that book, like this one, and there are others, and then being able to reconstitute the program of that book. So we have learned how that book was fully illuminated, and at the same time, we made the discovery they were copying that book when they created these mosaics. So what I want to suggest by introduction is simply that there's a lot more going on in these images than just Moses and Jethro and Jesus and others playing out Christian scripture in a way that provides images to the faithful. There's much more going on. The Church of San Marco in Venice is a victory monument. It is a way of attesting to their preeminence in the Christian world as a powerful empire. Another example of this, and we're going to come back to this one in far more detail in discussion today, is this building. Does anybody know what this is? The Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, exactly right. I'll tell you another reason why teaching this class is great is because everybody here wants to be here. Everybody's interested in learning. And you don't have to say, Schmedlap, wake up over there. This is the church of the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, and it is one of the great examples, if not the greatest example, of a certain form of Gothic architecture produced in the middle of the 13th century. Overwhelming decorative and pictorial program, dazzling. It's about something very particular as well, just like San Marco in Venice is about. So what I want to suggest then is that we can begin to understand medieval iconography by taking a contextual approach, understanding where these cultures came from. What were these people concerned with? And I begin this with an observation which might seem obvious. It wasn't to me initially. Medieval people were a whole lot like us. They just behaved differently. The world of images in which they operated was almost exclusively religious. But they were every bit as rapacious and envious and self-absorbed and secular as we are. They just had to work within the confines of a different culture. So to begin to extract what they were really about, you have to see past those images that are on the surface and engage in them in a contextual way. So for us to do that today, we are going to spend the next 80 minutes doing that. And it really has to start, I'm going to give a very brief overview on the development of the ideas that give rise to crusading. And the first of them is the idea of pilgrimage as a fundamental part of what it means to be a Christian person who is observant. It is an interesting and I think powerful paradox that there is nothing in the preaching of Jesus Christ that speaks to what comes to be one of the great phenomena in the history of Western civilization. Christ always preached the immaterial as being primary. He wasn't interested in objects. He wasn't interested in what doesn't endure. The flesh will not endure. He wasn't interested in relics. He didn't build great monuments to himself. There was nothing about Christ's preaching that spoke to those things. Yet 11 minutes after he was crucified, Christians began to do those things. And I find it fascinating because it speaks to something fundamental and inexorable in the human condition. We are this way today. We all like to have stuff. We all like to collect things that are meaningful. I have in my office in Markle Hall a whole bunch of little shards of pottery that I picked up off the beach in Caesarea. And these are fragments of pottery from late antiquity. And I know this, Joan, because an expert who's a friend of mine and related to you told me exactly when they were made. Joan's brother is an archaeologist, and he saw my pot and my fragments, and he said, that would be 6th century. I think that's 4th century. And I'm no doubt he's right. But they're meaningful to me because of the way they allow me to connect myself to some aspect of the world that I don't otherwise have access to. That same impulse existed right from the onset of Christianity, and indeed pre-exists Christianity. The Jews went on pilgrimage too. There were sacred sites where the Jews would go. Other cultures did the same thing. So one of these great sites, of course, is Jerusalem, the site where the last chapter in the history of Christ's preaching on earth played out. And the city of Jerusalem was, right from the onset, right from the beginning, a place where Christians began to come visit. They wanted to see the place where Christ was crucified. They wanted to see the place where he was resurrected. And they began to come. So much so that by the beginning of the 4th century, and here's another view of Jerusalem from a different angle, and it's a very complicated city, but here you can see this is the Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock exists today. Here, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, both of which have a certain history going back to the early Middle Ages. And if this were a clearer slide, we would be able to see these are the ancient walls here in the modern city. Over here, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is up there. Christians began to visit these sites early on, and quickly they became memorialized. Structures were built around them. Pilgrims would come. There became a certain commerce associated with pilgrimage. In late antiquity, it was a pretty perilous thing to do. Let's say you lived somewhere in Western Europe, in Italy or Germany or France, to decide you're going to go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. You'd have to walk, or maybe ride a horse, or get a ship. There wasn't a lot of that kind of transport available. It could take a year. It was a serious undertaking, but people did this in large numbers. And these sites quickly became famous. Of course, the center of that visit was for people to come and see the place where Christ's tomb existed. And today, have any of you ever been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem? Okay, a few of you have, and so you've seen this site. Inside this structure, which exists within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right on the spot where Christ was crucified, and then lowered from the cross, and where he was deposed, and then where he was buried, are all within the structure of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And here, within this place, was Christ's tomb, from which he was resurrected after 3 days, according to Christian tradition. By the 4th, 5th centuries, these were major sites. The Emperor Constantine, at the beginning of the 4th century, the first great Christian emperor, who converted to Christianity and issued the Edict of Tolerance that made the Roman Empire no longer persecute Christians, established under his auspices and with his resources a church called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre here in Jerusalem that provided this magnificent setting in which these holy sites could be visited. There were other sites throughout the ancient world that were important to Christian pilgrims, including this one. This is the city of Capernaum, which is on the Sea of Galilee, where Peter lived and worked, and where Christ first met him, John the Evangelist as well. This synagogue we're seeing here in this image is probably, although not certainly, the very place where Christ preached when he was in Capernaum. These sites were visited by the 2nd century. Peter's house came to be early on, it's the earliest pilgrimage site we can document, by 75 AD, a pilgrimage site. People were visiting this place. And his house was a mundane little brick stone structure. That would be a house. That would be another house. And it was here. We have texts from this period of people who went to visit these sites. And by the 5th century, so 400 or 500 AD, they constructed a church, a circular structure, over Peter's house, so that this idea began to be formed that these sacred sites took on a sacred significance and they would build churches over them. And we begin to see then this commingling of ideas of the sacred, ephemeral, spiritual world being merged permanently and indelibly with the material world. And that's a part of what we see in Christian art and architecture from the onset. But again, it isn't in the Bible. It comes from the human condition. This is just another view of Peter's house, and you get a sense for how mundane and rudimentary these structures were, but how important they come to be for archaeologists and pilgrims. So then the question is, why were these things so why? Why did people care? What was so compelling about this? You could just as easily read Scripture or talk about the faith. What is it that these places and these objects did for people? And there were several kinds of sacred materials. There were places where things happened that were of great significance, like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. There were also objects. If you could find, for example, the bones of a saint, they would be called relics. Those would be powerful. Then there were things called secondary relics. Those would be objects that came in contact with a sacred figure or a sacred place. So it could be the clothing of a saint. Or it could be as mundane as a clod of dirt removed from the place where Christ was crucified. Indeed, the tomb within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, now listen to this, it's very interesting. By the 5th and 6th centuries, people were traveling on these pilgrimages to go see it. They all wanted a souvenir of these places. So they would line up and go into the church, go up to the altar, to the tomb, just as you would do today, and you would be able to take a little bit of dirt from that spot home with you. The problem was they ran out of dirt. So every day they would bring in a bulldozer load of dirt and put it in there, and people would go. And people knew that was happening, but it didn't matter. It wasn't that it's not authentic dirt. There was something electrifying that took place when that material touched the place where Christ was crucified or where he was resurrected or whatever it was, and it gave it a certain spiritual magnificence. It didn't matter to them. They knew it had just been brought in. It's almost like we all want to shake hands with a great celebrity or terrific figure. Something happens when you say, well, I had a chance to shake the hands of Franklin Roosevelt, or whatever it is. There's something about that contact that connects us physically. This is an example of that. This is a box that was carried around under his arm by a pilgrim to the Holy Land in the 6th century. So imagine this, 500 AD. This guy was an Italian. Well, he lived in Italy. He wasn't an Italian. He was a guy in Italy. There was a difference in the 5th century. He was a Roman. He takes this box and he goes to the Holy Land, and he has painted on the inner cover of this box the places he visited with the narrative of what happened on it. So here we see the crucifixion of Christ. Not the best slide, but I can do better. You can see it better here. These are not high-quality images. These are not paintings that we would look at and say, wow, these are really good. What we would say is, wow, they're really important. They're interesting. They're historically valuable records. Various narrative moments from the life of Christ. The angels visiting the tomb, and the archangel Gabriel says, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? There is nobody inside." That was when they knew that Christ had been resurrected. Here we see the ascension of Christ. Various narrative moments. Each of these images was put on this box because the guy went there. And then he filled the box with little bits of dirt and stuff. What's in the box now? It's the same stuff, and it has little tags on it. So this is in the Vatican Museum in Rome. And you can look at it, and you can see these little inscriptions that say, rock taken from the shore of the Sea of Galilee, or whatever it was that he took. And sort of like the way people do today. Well, I show these to you to suggest how powerful this connection to the material world was for medieval society, and that how in that respect our existence hasn't changed much. These are more sophisticated but contemporary examples of the same thing. This is an ampulla. Pilgrim would wear it around his neck, or her neck, be about this big. Cheap lead thing. It was not expensive to buy one of these things. Any pilgrim could get hold of it. And it would be worn almost like an amulet, and they would walk around from place to place. It could be filled with oil, sometimes with little dirt, and the oil would be in there, and you'd take a ribbon or something, and you'd drop it down to the site, maybe a tomb, and you'd touch the object to the tomb, and then put the oil back in the amulet, and you begin to turn this into a sacred object. And we have many textual references from this period of people taking these things home, hanging it over their bed, because they've been besieged by demons, and this will stop that nonsense. Or I haven't been feeling well, and this will make me better. Or my son is sick. Whatever it was, there was a magical power seen to be in these things. The level of superstition was powerful. Some of them have a single image, and some of them have many. Here we see really nothing more than what is a sequence of picture postcards of places where these pilgrims went, exactly like the box that I just showed you. So I set all of this up to establish a point, namely that the material world was of central importance to pilgrims from the onset, and that provides us with a foundation to understand Crusader culture. That's point one. The Crusaders called themselves and thought of themselves always as pilgrims. They didn't distinguish so well the difference between quietly, modestly going to pray at a place and going home, with bringing your hardware with you, killing everybody, and taking the place over, which is the difference between crusading and pilgrimage. But they thought of themselves as pilgrims, and by the time of the Crusades, by the 11th century, this notion of sacred travel was so central a part of Crusader of European culture, Christian culture, that it was simply a part of what people did all the time. By the end of the 10th and 11th century, pilgrimage all over Europe was a big deal. So you don't have to go, let's say we're all living in Paris in 1100, 1050. We don't have to go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land to have a sacred experience. There are sites everywhere that are designed for pilgrimage. There were what were called highways of the faithful. We could go from Paris through southern France to one of the great sites, and that is the Church of Santiago de Compostela in Spain, where the remains of the relics of St. James were located, believed to be. And along the way, every single day, have a monument to visit, a place to pray, and a place to sleep. And along the way, you would find many other pilgrims. You'd find prostitutes. You'd find highwaymen. You'd find people who would rob you. Don't bring too much money with you because it will be stolen. It was a whole social phenomenon that people engaged in. And Europe is now filled everywhere you go with these kinds of monuments. Here I show you a wonderful example, the Church of Sainte-Foy at Conques, built in the 11th century, southwestern France, right on the way from Paris to Santiago de Compostela. A beautiful Romanesque church, which I'm not going to spend too much time on here, but that's the outside. The building was adorned with decoration that, once again, same idea, heavy Christian themes, go figure, but also meaning in these images that spoke to different audiences. Not a great slide. Over the entryway to the church is a really magnificent stone sculpture in the tympanum, showing a narrative scene of the Last Judgment. In and of itself, interesting. If we had time, we don't today to do this, we can unpack all of the meanings within this image. This is not just Christ at the end of time saving these people and damning these people. These are specific people that everybody knows who they are. The guy who found the relics that created the monastery is right there. This is Charlemagne. These are people who are being consigned to hell, including that couple down the street who committed adultery, and we know who they are. It's really fascinating. So it's a kind of celestial theme writ local. And if we ask the right questions, we can understand that. Pilgrims would have the experience to interact with this art, and all of this produced not only, some details of that, a phenomenon that engaged people in this kind of public activity, but also a culture with objects and poetry and music and commerce. It was a whole culture associated with pilgrimage. The real destination, purpose at Sainte Foy at Conques was to see the relics of a beautiful little girl named Sainte Foy, who was maybe in the 3rd century, 2nd century, called upon to renounce her belief in Christianity and to acknowledge that the emperor of Rome was a god. And this little girl, maybe she was 12 or 13, wouldn't do that. So they tried to cut off her head. It didn't work. Then they tried to beat her with sticks. That didn't work. And there's this whole litany of grotesque and ghastly things they did to Sainte Foy. But her faith carried her through, and they were unable in the end to prevail. I don't know how she actually died in the end. But her relics were brought to Sainte Foy, to Conques, and they named this church Sainte Foy, Saint Faith, after her. They created this church, and that was a pilgrimage site, a really high-level pilgrimage site in the 12th century. The puzzling thing is now you're looking at this image of Sainte Foy. Isn't she an adorable little 13-year-old girl? Don't you want to just put her on your lap? Look at that image. It has nothing to do with the 13-year-old girl. That's the head from a Roman sculpture, covered with jewels and gold. It's about something other than poor little Sainte Foy. It's about the magnificence and opulence of reliquaries. And it looks the way it does because it wants to speak, even in the 12th century, to its antiquity as an object from the early Christian period. So even then, they're beginning to think about how you create images that are imbued with other meanings. So Sainte Foy, a very interesting object. Once a year, this sculpture is carried through the streets of the city of Conques, just as it was 1,000 years ago. So our context then for crusading is to understand that pilgrimage was a very central part of the Christian faith and the social fabric of Western Europe from the onset of Christianity. So what happens that leads to this transformation of this cultural idea and turns society into crusaders? And I can assure you this question is as timely today as it ever has been, because the wars that we suffer, that we live through in the Middle East, ain't a whole lot different. And it began in some ways as a historical accident. In November, specifically on November the 27th in 1095, the Pope was visiting, Urban II is his name, was visiting in Clermont, France. And he gave a speech of the sort he gave a lot of. These were political creatures, not just religious creatures in the Middle Ages. They had all kinds of agendas. He was seeking to deal with the variety of challenges facing his administration that had to do with the increasing divisiveness of the Christian communities in Western Europe. People were starting to battle with each other at higher levels than he was satisfied. There was a lot of political intrigue. So one way to solve that problem is to create a common enemy, to mobilize people to focus together on something else. We saw something like that here in this country after 9/11. We enjoyed the greatest period of community solidarity probably since the Second World War for a period of months. This is what Urban II was seeking to do when he made a speech calling for a crusade to the Holy Land to aid our Christian brethren who are suffering in the Holy Land at the hands of the infidel, who have no respect for God, who torture and defile our citizens, who rape the women and kill the children. May I speak further of these abominations? Then he did. It was a remarkable speech. It was filled with reasons why all Christians should be deeply offended by what they understood from the Pope to be happening in the Holy Land. He told them that this was a real threat to all Christians, that what was happening there. He told them that the infidel had no respect or faith whatsoever in the Western world. He told them of the suffering and the torture to all Christians. Then he said to them, why do you not rise up and support us in battling this common enemy of Christ? Notwithstanding Christ's preaching of peace and love, when the faith itself is attacked, you have a right and an obligation to respond. And I'm calling upon you as the head of the faith to do so. So don't give me any excuses about family. Those obligations are not as important as your commitments to Christ. Don't tell me of other family problems or the lack of resources. And he goes through this whole litany of things that should mobilize people to engage in this crusade with him. Most important, you might not survive the crusade. And if you don't, you will enjoy the imperishable rewards of martyrdom beside Christ for eternity. There is a special room in paradise for those of you who will die for the faith. It was a powerful speech, and most interesting and quite remarkable, it was far more effective than he had any idea it would be. It wasn't his plan to change the entire landscape of Western Europe for centuries. All he was trying to do was solve a problem locally, engage people in an activity that would be productively redirecting of their energies. But that speech took hold and captured the popular imagination in ways that is the stuff of great historical importance. And again, I don't think we need to go into that today in great detail, except to say that it was maybe the most effective speech given in 500 years. And the consequences were that Western Europe stood up and began to create armies to go on crusading. And there are many sociological, historical, economic, and political reasons for this, including there was enough excess income in the community at that time where families could send one or two of their kids to go do that. There were plenty of people who wanted that adventure because imagine you're the second-born son of a farmer in France. You're not going to get the property. That's going to your big brother. You got nothing unless you want to go into a monastery, and many guys didn't want to do that. So if you go on crusade, you might be able to take a territory somewhere in the golden land of Jerusalem and have your own empire there. Property, that was another thing the Pope said. When you get there, what you conquer will be yours. So have at it. It was, for all those reasons, a remarkable moment, and the crusading enterprise was undertaken. November 27th, 1095. Quite remarkably, astonishingly, 4 years later, on July 15th, 1099, the Crusaders actually conquered Jerusalem. Militarily, strategically, there is no reason to justify that result. The Muslims were in enormous numbers. Muslims had billions of people over here. You have this little beach, and you got Crusaders coming to this beach. Jerusalem is here. How did it happen that they were able to push back and create a Crusader kingdom? And this is a later image of what it looked like, but in red is what the Crusader territories look like in the Holy Land. This is present-day Israel and Syria north and so on. So you get a sense for where we are. Jerusalem is here. One reason is that nobody took them seriously. These Muslims, and they weren't one Muslim community, there were many different communities there, but they were simply surprised by this activity. But the result was that in 1099, the magic and the power of Urban II's words were now taken seriously. Surely God is with us if we were able to accomplish that. Ironically, and for the next 200 years, that success was never matched. The crusading enterprise, there was crusade after crusade, army after army, mostly failures. Modest successes, mostly failures. They could never recapture the same level of success that they achieved in the First Crusade. But the idea had enormous power for people. Something about this resonated with Europeans at that time. So that's our context. Pilgrimage becomes fundamentally important. Crusading is an outgrowth of pilgrimage, but categorically different, as I said. Now let's hone in our story more precisely on Louis IX, Saint Louis, the King of France. Born in 1214, he died in 1270. He ruled from 1226 to 1270. Widely seen by historians, one of the most important and influential kings of France in all of its history. More than anyone else during his time as king, he gathered up a confederation of independent aristocracies in France and united them into a kingdom, which eventually became a nation. Inauspicious beginnings to his life, but a very powerful and successful reign as king. At the center of his strategy and his personal identity was an overwhelming interest in the Christian faith, and more particularly in relics. He himself had always said throughout his life that if he had a choice, he would be a monk working in a monastery and not the King of France. That wasn't his idea. It just happened to be how he was born. And he tried somehow to merge these different aspects of his personality and his situation in a way that allowed him to serve the nation in his own personal interest. In 1239, so Louis is a young king. His father had died in 1226, which is when he became king. His mother, Blanche of Castile, a very powerful figure in her own right, was pretty much running the show and was very influential over him in ways that's sort of interesting and complicated and Freudian. In 1239, he had an opportunity to buy this object that you see on the screen. Anybody know what this is? This is the crown of thorns, believed throughout history to be the object that was placed on Christ's head at the time he was crucified. This is the most important relic in all of the Christian world. It had existed since the time of its discovery, during the period of Heraclius in the late antique period. So it has a kind of pedigree. It doesn't go back to the time of Christ, but it does go back to late antiquity, maybe the 3rd, 4th century. It was in the treasury of the Bucolian Palace in Constantinople. This was the most important relic the Byzantines held. When the Crusaders in 1204, led by the Venetians, with whom we began, got to Constantinople, not only did they take the Cotton Genesis and the Quadriga and all the other things, they took that. And by 1239, they couldn't afford to keep it because they needed money to hire mercenaries to defend their kingdom from the Byzantines who wanted it back. Bear in mind, these are all Christians. They're all going to church on Sunday, and the rest of the week they're doing this. A very puzzling thing. Yes, sir?
Wasn't there a schism, though, between the East and the Western Christian churches?
There was. By the 11th century, 1066 or 1063, they permanently divided and agreed, we're not going to agree anymore. That said, they still helped each other some, and when Urban II preached his crusade in 1099, after the schism, it was intended in part to go help our Byzantine friends who are suffering from the infidel. And they did that for 100 years, from 1095 till 1204, 100 years later, when, in fact, they just decided to go after Constantinople. So they took this object, and the pretender to the Byzantine throne, who was himself a Westerner, a Latin, needed to raise money to hire mercenary armies. Baldwin II was his name. So he reached out to his cousin, these people were all related, Louis IX in France, and said, you want to buy this? It's expensive, but it's authentic. And Louis did. He wanted to buy this because he believed that if he could possess these relics. Now remember the mindset of what relics could do for people and what they meant to people. This is not a clot of dirt that was picked up around the tomb of Christ. This was the crown of thorns. They believed, absolutely were persuaded, convinced, knew that had been on Christ's head at the time he was crucified. Louis said, I will, and I will pay anything. And so he had to pay a lot. I don't remember exactly, but a lot. In 1239. And Baldwin II then had already actually pawned this object, believe it or not, to a pawnbroker in Venice, because he needed the cash fast. So Louis's emissaries had to go to the pawnbroker and give them the money to get that. And they brought this object back to Paris, and when they did, the Archbishop of Sens, one of the most famous, important religious figures in France, said the following. Our Lord and Redeemer himself, has transferred the holy tokens of his most sacred passion from the region of Greece to France. In this way, with their honors now equal, he has raised up one land to the level of the other. For he has thought it right to crown with much glory and manifold honor the kingdom of France. Hugely important text. What he's telling us, this archbishop, is that this object did not get to France because Louis had the cash. It got to France because Christ willed it. Relics were so powerful, they didn't do anything they didn't want to do. It was destiny that the crown of thorns would find its way to Paris. And now we begin a chapter in the kingship of Louis IX that redefines the nation of France and Western Europe. Because indeed, with the acquisition of this object, he began to position himself as the most Christian king. he had, through this acquisition, supplanted the Byzantine Empire as the most powerful, important, and sacred empire under Christ. And now the new Holy Land was in France. That's how powerful and important this was. In order to memorialize that transaction, Louis did more. He decided not to take this reliquary and put it in the Church of Saint-Denis outside of Paris, which is where all the relics were, nor did he decide to give it to Notre Dame, the Cathedral of Paris. He decided rather to build a new structure just for that object that would be his. And the reason was he wanted to associate himself with this reliquary. This was about, in part, him as the most Christian king and the possession of the empire, the king, not the bishop or whatever. So he creates the Sainte-Chapelle he has built beginning in 1241. I should also tell you, 2 years later, Baldwin II, running out of money again, spent all his money from Louis and said, I got more. If you really like the crown of thorns, how about the true cross? I have that, and I have a lot of other things. A whole thesaurus of relics, the largest and most powerful, important collection of relics associated directly with Christ in the world. He was going to sell the rest of them to Louis for another large amount of money. Louis agreed to do it, and he bought them. So the true cross, fragments of the true cross, pieces of wood, large pieces of wood that were believed to have been from the crucifix that Christ was crucified on, were brought to Paris as well, in a big box with a whole bunch of other things. Now Louis had it all. All of those objects were in Paris. He begins construction then of this great building, which interestingly, in the 13th century, was built within the complex of the king's government. It remains today within the complex of the French government. For those of you who have been there, you know you have to go through a metal detector and you got to wait in a line, and there are the courts right here, government complex. Interesting that that was the case in the 13th century, and it remains the case today. That's something about the continuity of European culture. Imagine that in this country. I mean, I've been going to France for 30 years, and the menus haven't changed at the restaurants I go to. Nothing changes there. So he has constructed the Sainte-Chapelle. It is a very interesting building architecturally, in part because of the extraordinary illusionism of the form of Gothic architecture that was used to create it. From the outside, it looks like it has big windows. Also has a lot of stone, big, heavy structure, kind of light in the windows, but pretty massive. One is not prepared for the interior, even today, when you go inside, and it appears to all effects that there are no walls, that the building just seems to rise up as a magnificent cage of glass with gilding in between. But it is an illusion. Each of these piers has behind it a very thick work of buttressing to hold the building up, and one of these pieces of strips of what appear to be just trim around the windows are actually a leaded steel or a leaded piece of metal to hold the building together like a girdle. So it's a very sophisticated example of Rayonnant Gothic architecture. Worth discussing, but we're not going to do that today. This building then, in the first instance, was about his desire to memorialize his collection of relics. It was his own personal chapel. There was a doorway from the inside of that chapel directly to his apartment. So he could go in there any time to pray, and he did. And whenever dignitaries would come to visit him, he would take them in there and trot out the relics. He would show them to people. He would then give them a thorn from the crown of thorns. So the king of Denmark comes, he gives him a thorn. The archbishop of so-and-so, he gives him a thorn. The interesting thing there is if you were to gather all those thorns together today, it's a very large bag of thorns. But this is what he did. It indeed led to a whole series of buildings that looked just like this one, only smaller, that were constructed all over France, little Sainte-Chapelles. And most of them have a thorn in them. So imagine planting seeds, and these little, boom, little Sainte-Chapelles popped up all over. There are 20 or 30 of them. The decorative program in this building, in the first instance, then, was about making this building the new Holy Land, making this, memorializing this idea that Jerusalem and Constantinople have now been supplanted by a new Holy Land right in Paris. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that gets done in the decorative program here. All religious images, it's not about them. That's, again, we're going to see past those. In the middle, but before I go through that, the story gets a little more complicated. In the middle of the construction of this building in 1244, Louis IX, who is on his way, he has these relics, he's got his thing, he is stricken ill and on his death. And let me read to you what happens. So this is from the account of his biographer, Jean de Jonville, who writes a biography of Louis IX, and this is the account of him getting sick. It happened by God's will that King Louis, who was then in Paris, was taken very seriously ill, and came at last so near to dying that one of the two ladies who were tending him wanted to draw the sheet over his face, maintaining that he was dead. But another lady, who was at the opposite side of the bed, would not allow it, and said she was sure his soul was still in his body. As the king lay listening to the dispute between the two ladies, our Lord worked within him and quickly brought him back to such a state of health that although up till then he had not been able to utter a word, he now recovered his speech. As soon as he was able to speak, he asked for the cross to be given to him. This was promptly done. Does anyone know what that meant, to ask for the cross, what he was doing? Yes, sir.
Picking up a crusading obligation to fight against holiness.
Exactly. Taking the cross was swearing a vow that you would go on crusade to the Holy Land, and it was irretrievable. If you said you would take the cross and then you didn't go, you would be excommunicated from the church, which was the equivalent of death to a king of France. So his mother, Blanche of Castile, who was pretty heavy-handed and had other ideas for her boy, was mortified by this decision of Louis to go on crusade. I should also say that we're now 150 years into crusading from 1095, and crusading was seen as a failure, a bad idea. You know, it's a little bit like some of the wars that we have fought recently where people think, why are we there, and what are we doing, and how do we get out, and why do we want to put more men and material into this? Same question. Why are we pursuing this strategy to reconquer the Holy Land? What's in it for us? Why would we waste treasure and people and so forth? Blanche was mortified. So she went to the Bishop of Paris and said, you need to help me. My son has taken the cross, and we need a way out. And the bishop thought about it, and he said, well, there is a way out. Louis was, of course, attestably delirious from fever and not a rational human being, and therefore temporary insanity. He didn't make a decision at a time of compos mentis. So the bishop went to Louis and said that. He said, of course, you weren't right in the head, and we understand, and I'm telling you now that you do not have an obligation to take the cross. So Louis said, thank you, I appreciate it, and he tore the cross dramatically from his sleeve, and he gave it to the bishop, and he said, you see, I've given it back to you, and I am completely sane. And he said, yes, you are, and he said, then give me the cross. And that was his way of saying discussion was over. He was going to the Holy Land. Louis didn't just decide to be a crusader. He made the decision, he did everything in a big way. He made the decision to mount the largest crusade in the history of crusading, bigger than Urban II. The biggest crusade ever was going to be launched from the shores of France when he raised all the men and material and so forth to do it. But his commitment then for the next chapter of his life, and indeed it's the dominant theme for the rest of his life, was to be a crusader to try to reclaim the Holy Land. The interesting irony in this is he had made this decision only shortly after he made Paris the new Holy Land. Why do you need to go there? It's all here. But I think, and I have read, this is the area around which most of my scholarship in medieval art has been based, and I know this guy. I think this comes from an impulse to capture these territories, to possess them all, to make unequivocally this statement about the power of places and that they are all within his kingdom. That he was so entranced by what he did for Paris, the original needed to be theirs as well. And it was theirs by divine right, because none of this would have been possible if Christ wasn't with me at every step of the way. And that's important. People make irrational decisions when they believe that they have Allah or Christ or God or whoever it is behind them. That's what happens here, and that's what happened for Louis. So he made the decision to be a crusader. As the decoration of this building was being completed, 1244, the building's halfway up. 1248, 4 years later, is when the crusade sets off. He had a harbor built in France so that the crusade could leave from French territory, not a trivial expenditure. He needed to send provisions to the island of Cyprus so that when the Crusaders, his armies, his 60 ships, arrived in Cyprus, they could winter there. And the mountains of grain that he had delivered there were so massive that people thought the mountains, because by the time they got there, they were all covered in grass, sort of like that Mulch farm just off Route 22 that's covered in grass and it looks like mountains. If you don't live around here, you don't know what I'm talking about. Same idea. A big enterprise. Those 4 years that the crusade was being launched, he was also finishing the decoration of this building. And I would like to suggest these two themes of crusading and relics are at the very center of the decorative program of this building. So now let's unpack the decoration. Many of you have been inside already. Yes, I mean, we already covered that. A lot of you have been in the Sainte-Chapelle. Can you raise your hands again? Just, okay. It is unquestionably dazzling. So your first impulse is to think what this building is about is magnificent materials. This looks like a jewel box. That makes sense because it's a reliquary. The relics of the Passion, the crown of thorns, the fragments of the true cross, were in a box in here. The box it was in cost, wait for it, 2.5 times more than the whole building and all of its decoration. Just the box. Go figure, in the French Revolution, they melted it down and it's gone. But we have images of it, and I'll show you one later. This was a dazzling display of wealth, comparable and indeed more profound than any image of anything in Byzantium. And commentators from early on wrote about this. In the 14th century, the famous poet Jean of Jandon wrote about this. He said, "The refined colors of its paintings, the precious gilding of its images, the pure transparency of its windows which shimmer from all sides, the mystical powers of its altars, the marvelous adornment of its shrines studded with precious stones, give to this house of prayer such a degree of beauty that on entering one would think oneself transported to heaven, and one might with reason imagine oneself taken into one of the most beautiful rooms of paradise." That was the reaction people had to the Sainte-Chapelle. At least once a year, he opened this building up to the population of Paris. They would line up and come in and see this building. So they then could walk away thinking, this king has real power. This guy is the real thing. Okay, we have a problem here, because I touched something. It's bad. Hang on. And you people didn't think I could do it. Sorry. With you in 1 second. Okay, here we are. So people all saw the decorative program. Now let me take you through it briefly. You come into the building and yikes. The IT guy said, "You need me here?" And I said, "No." I look like an idiot. Yikes. You know how to do this? There's the timing thing here needs to be, maybe it's here. Yeah, oh, here it is. I got it. 3 seconds. I'm going to take it up to 3,000 seconds. There we go. You're all thinking, how am I going to get out of here now? This isn't good. I'd rather go on crusade. So as one enters the building at the lowest level, the first level, there's a hierarchical decorative scheme that we'll go through very briefly. The first level then is here, where you're standing, and then we work our way up. And imagine for the moment that you're guests of the king, and that I'm an employee of the king, and my job is to give you a tour, and I'm, say, a cleric of some sort. I'm knowledgeable about this. At the lowest level, ringing the lowest interior, are a series of medallions that were filled in. They were painted medallions that in enamel. They were very beautiful images. All 44 of these images that encircle the lower perimeter, all 44 are images of people being murdered. They are scenes of martyrdom. These are all figures from the history of Christianity. The only example in medieval art of a cycle of martyrs that are all action scenes. These are not portraits of martyrs. This isn't St. Sebastian's face. This is him being shot with arrows. In every one of them. So one guy is being, an anchor's tied to his neck and he's thrown in the water. I mean, it's ghastly. All 44 of these, then, are images of people doing what crusaders are supposed to do. What are martyrs? Martyrs are witnesses to the faith of Christ who pay the ultimate price by dying in activating their faith. And they therefore enjoy a certain special privilege in paradise. What we see on this level is that human beings' best opportunity for celestial magnificence is to be a martyr. If you're not born an apostle or you're not born into some special role, you can serve the church in this way. And these were all ordinary people who died for the faith in this way. The only example in medieval art. Moreover, all 44 of these images relate to martyrs whose relics were somewhere around Paris. So this was a local cult, and that, in fact, there are references to when the crown of thorns was being brought back to Paris from Constantinople. People were bringing these relics out from churches all over France and putting them in front of the crown of thorns so that, in a sense, Christ's relics could communicate with these other relics. I believe that the purpose of these images was in part to reaffirm this idea of dying for one's faith in a manner that's entirely consistent with the preaching of the crusade. As we work our way up, there were a series of images of the apostles, 12 in number, encircling this area here. This is, by the way, a reconstruction of the building. The Sainte-Chapelle was renovated very thoughtfully in the 19th century, and these images come from that time period, and we have a sense for how they reconstructed them with high levels of accuracy. So I'm not showing you the original structure. I'm showing you the images as they would have appeared in the 13th century. The apostles stand between the earthly zone and the celestial zone supporting the building. Indeed, they are, of course, the foundation of the church, the pillars of the church, literally, and here literally, but also, of course, spiritually. And that's the role they play here. These were among the finest examples of Gothic sculpture produced in the 13th century. So Louis IX mobilized very high levels of art in producing this stuff. It wasn't just done quickly, it was done lavishly. But the real story, of course, is the stained glass. This cycle is very, very powerful and comprehensive. There are images all the way up the walls, all the way around. This is the west end of the building where you would come in, up these circular staircases. The altar with the crown of thorns would be here at the east end. We have images from the Old Testament working their way around, except in here we have some New Testament images from the life of Christ and his passion and prophets. And the rest of it is our Old Testament narrative. So Genesis begins here, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and around. And then here, most remarkably here, first time in medieval art, this window is dedicated to the story of the acquisition of the relics. So the story, Christian history, does not end with the resurrection of Christ. It continues with the story of the objects left back on earth that aren't supposed to be important if you read the Bible, but here they are. So we have stories of Heraclius, the Byzantine Empire, saving the crown of thorns. Then we see Louis IX himself, the guy who paid for the building, in the glass, doing things with the relics. We see him greeting the emissaries from Venice, carrying the relics through the streets of Paris. We see this in the glass. And what's so interesting about this is that by placing these images in this narrative sequence, by visualizing them, they become real. It becomes all true. It becomes part of sacred history. It's an interesting logical reversal. And indeed, ecclesiastic figures wrote about this in the Middle Ages. When an image existed, it proved the truth of the story. So that somebody could something, that makes it true. That is to say that in seeing these images, there's no question that the relics were real and that Louis has this sacred role because Louis couldn't play that role if he didn't have Christ's support. Enormously powerful propaganda about Louis's role in the world among Christians. He was chosen by God to do this work. He was, in a sense, at this moment, 1245, 1246, absolutely indomitable because he had the will of Christ behind him. And it's attested in these images. But let's stop that story for a minute. Look at this image. I'm telling you a pretty complicated story about what all these images mean. But if I were to say to you, okay, who wants to tell us what these images are? Why don't we talk about them? You're all educated people. Many of you know something about Christian images. Who wants to unpack this? Let's look at that. You would say, I don't have any idea what you're talking about. I can't even figure out who these people are. I can't even tell if they are people. It's just hard. So one might legitimately ask, Professor Weiss, is it possible you're kind of making this up? Isn't it possible that maybe these stories aren't that complicated, that it's about sacred history? And how do we know how to read these things? If they're all so rich in content and meaning, how do we know? The answer to that question resides in a field of study that's related to how iconographic programs are read. We don't read these images literally. They are not a story to us like a book, where you turn the page and there's a story and you just keep doing that. Rather, if we were to stand in the middle of the Sainte-Chapelle, and I've done this with students, and look around, and I'd ask you, what do you see? If you were looking around and we had enough time, you would begin to see certain themes. You would say, I see a lot of people who look like this guy doing exactly this thing. Why are there so many kings? By the way, he's holding a fleur-de-lis scepter. And who is he? He looks like Louis IX to me. Well, he's not. Actually, this is one of the leaders of the tribes of Judah from the book of Numbers in the Old Testament, which, by the way, says nothing about him dressing up like Louis IX. These images, if we were standing in the Sainte-Chapelle looking at the altar, on the left, there are about 20 of them in a row. Same guy. Boom, boom, boom. These are the leaders of the tribes of Judah. But that's not what you would see if you were looking at them. You would see kingship, French kingship, the integration, both explicitly and implicitly, of the French image of kingship into sacred history. So one theme in this building, all over these narrative scenes, hundreds of them, is royal kingship of the sort that looks just like Louis. You can be, any idiot would get that. That's not high level. You don't need Vincent of Beauvais to explain that to you. Not that anybody in this room is an idiot. I'm not saying that. Yes.
I think you were done.
You thought I was done? Yeah, sorry. But interrupt me if you...
No, I want to see if you say what I think you're missing.
Okay. That's a lot of pressure. So we're just going to stay here, and I'm going to just keep talking until you nod your head.
Play around with the slides and the timing and that.
Right. One theme is this idea of sacred kingship. Another one, less obvious, but if you're looking for it, they're there, are scene after scene after scene of idolatry. Idolatry is the worshiping of false idols, which is something proscribed by the Christian faith and absolutely by the Jews. Here we see some figures worshiping idols. They're kneeling down and praying to idols. One of them, remarkably, helps us crack what that means, and it says Mohammed on it. These are a proxy image in sacred history to talk about the Muslims and the infidel in the Holy Land. We have to go on crusade to the Holy Land to fight the same kind of battles that Joshua and David fought, because we must crush the infidel, who are in this case engaging in idolatry. And you see it again and again and again throughout the building in levels disproportionate to the narrative. The third theme that you see in great numbers are scenes of battle. And they all, by the way, look like Louis IX. So here we see Joshua dressed up as a French king, engaged in some sort of holy war. There are other themes, but those are three. So if you're standing in the building, what I would like to suggest is that the narrative from Genesis, Exodus, all the way around is not what's most important. What's most important are the themes embedded in that sacred history. What can we learn from sacred history? What does it tell us, we Franks in the middle of the 13th century? It tells us that we have a sacred responsibility to continue the work of, many of these, by the way, are Jews, not Christians, but there is the continuity, and they are, of course, embraced by the Christians. We must continue the work of these great sacred figures. So I, Louis IX, am like Solomon in that I have built a house here that is like the house of God Solomon built in Jerusalem. That was exactly what he was doing. How do I know that? Here's Louis marching around with the relics, by the way. I'm going to come back to that in a second. So here's Louis and his brother carrying the relics of the crown of thorns through the city. They don't wear shoes because they're acting like they're pilgrims. and they go from town to town doing this. Here they display the crown of thorns, and the Archbishop of Sens, whose text I read earlier, is standing behind it. This great majestic procession bringing these relics are embedded in the glass. And at the very top window of this scene is the king himself presiding over the worship of the relics, surrounded by members of his kingdom, his court. So this idea then is he is building a new house of God, commensurate and comparable to the house of God that Solomon built in Jerusalem. I made this discovery when I was writing a book about this, by virtue of the images that I have, the arguments that I've made here, and they're longer and more boring, but I'm giving you the Reader's Digest version. Another architectural historian made the discovery after that the dimensions of the Sainte-Chapelle are exactly the same as the dimensions of the Temple of Solomon as recounted in the Bible. That there's no question what these guys were doing was a very complicated symbolic language of association to biblical history in the narrative programs, in the iconic images, and even in the fabric or the structural design of the building using the same measurements. So there's no doubt that what Louis is trying to do is create a new sacred landscape comparable to the old one. The center theme of this building then was the reliquary I talked about. This is an image taken of it. It looks like a little Sainte-Chapelle. This was called the Grand Chose, this famous box. And inside it, it hinged and opened up, were all these relics that Louis had. We know what it looks like, but as I said, it no longer survives.
What happened to the relics?
The crown of thorns is in Paris Cathedral. And if you go into the treasury in Paris Cathedral, Notre Dame, on Easter, you can see it. I have a slide of it. I mean, I was showing you a slide of it. It's there. The Christian world does no longer places emphasis on relics the way they did in the Middle Ages, but they have them. And there are treasuries where you can see relics, and those relics are all in Paris Cathedral.
I guess to clarify the question, when the box was destroyed, what happened to the other relics that were in it?
Well, it's a very good question. Most of the Christian the relics of Christ were saved, and they're in either Saint-Denis or in Paris Cathedral. How they got at what moment, I don't know. But the French revolutionaries were more interested in the monetary value of the box than in the relics, and so they weren't dispersed and they weren't lost, most of them.
Getting back to the story, what's in this for Louis IX? I mean, is this a temporal exercise that he's doing? Is this to preserve his power in kingship? Or is this a spiritual exercise?
Wonderful question, and the answer is because both. That's why he was so authentic a medieval king, because he genuinely, truly believed in the spiritual issues with which he was contending, at the same time that he understood the power of this kind of religious positioning as a secular leader. And so the answer is that what he was creating here was a monument that was consistent with his faith, but also a political gesture that made him the most powerful king in Europe, and that allowed him to have suasion over all of the territories in France. His prestige was unmatchable. And he used both very effectively. He was a savvy politician and a pious man. So there was the investment in all these relics, in the Grand Chose, in the building, and in its decoration was staggering. But was it an investment that paid off? And the answer is unquestionably it was. It allowed him to create the nation of France in a vision that was consistent with his plans. Now I'm really nervous because I don't know if I answered your question or not, and I'm kind of done with this.
Trying to figure out how to say it. When I went there, it was many, many years ago, and I knew nothing about what you just said at all. I had no inkling. I mean, I could see figures, but I knew nothing about these sacred items and everything. But I think the thing that really drew me there, that people said go, because it was on one of the islands, Sainte-Chapelle,
Ile de la Cité.
On Marseille.
Yeah.
Was the brilliancy of the color of the glass. It's one of the most beautiful places, I think, in the world, the glass. And there's this, I don't know, have you ever been there?
Yeah.
Have you ever been to the second floor little chapel?
Yeah.
There's a small chapel on the second floor that is just, you sit in there and it just surrounds you, this real, it's like, I think, a reddish color, a lot of it in that little chapel. It is just gorgeous.
It is, and there's a lot that can be said about what those colors meant in the medieval world. All of these themes the subject matter, the narrative programs, the color, the decoration, all of these things had meaning, including the colors. And there was a whole theory about what these colors do as the sun shines through and lights up these images. They transport you spiritually to a new place. And there were theologians who wrote that exact thing about stained glass, which is why it was so important. And that's what they're doing here. So this is a universe that is in some ways very different from ours, but in other ways not. Louis's aspirations were not so different from other political leaders. This was the vehicle with which they used them. In the interest of time, I'm not going to spend any more of our time going through the meaning of the building because I think my point has been made as emphatically as is necessary. Suffice it to say that the building then and its decoration spoke both to his spiritual aspirations and his political ones, and that memorialized his commitment to relics as a powerful device of the faith and to his commitment to crusading. So in 1248, in April of 1248, this building the Sainte-Chapelle was dedicated, and 6 weeks later he left for crusade. He was leading an army that was the largest, most well-equipped ever, and confident that he had the power of the Lord behind him. His crusade was an absolute disaster. He arrived in Cyprus and wintered there with his armies, and then they decided to begin their crusade on the shores of Egypt, on the coast of Damietta. So they wintered on Cyprus, and then they started here. Through just an odd configuration of circumstances, when they got to Damietta, the city wasn't prepared to defend itself. The Sultan who ruled that city was sick and he wasn't there, and they sent carrier pigeons to tell him the Franks are coming, and the carrier pigeons went the wrong way, and there was no army there. So Louis's armies rode into Damietta and conquered immediately. Of course they did. He had Christ's power with him. So this delusion of omnipotence perpetuated itself, and then his luck ran out. The armies worked their way inland, and in the city of Mansura, they were trapped in a skirmish. His brother, Robert of Artois, who carried relics with him in Paris, was killed. The armies were routed. He was captured and dragged off in chains by the infidel. When he was there, Louis was a remarkable guy. When he was held there, he was befriended, because he was actually a very cool guy, by the Muslims, and they became friends, and they respected him, and he respected them, and they talked about their issues, and they talked about their different points of view. And while there, the emir Hussam al-Din asked him, and there was somebody who recorded this conversation. He said to the king, and please take this, King Louis, respectfully, but where did you come up with the idea of going on board ship, I'm quoting him, and riding the back of this sea, coming to a land so full of Muslims and soldiers, thinking that you could conquer it and become its ruler? This undertaking is the greatest risk to which you could possibly expose yourself and your subjects. The emir then went on to say to Louis that in our world, in the Muslim world, when a man exposes himself and his property to such a risk, his testimony is not accepted in a court of law because such behavior suggests that he is mentally defective. In response, and you know what's so interesting about this anecdote is he wasn't behaving rationally. There's nothing rational about crusade to the Holy Land. There's nothing militarily or tactically logical about the idea that 60 ships are with a few hundred horses and a bunch of guys in armor are going to be able to do this unless they have celestial power behind them. So Louis was captured, he was befriended, he was widely respected by his captors, and you don't ever kill a king because they're worth too much to be ransomed. So they began negotiating with Louis's family to have him ransomed. And so much did they respect him, this is like a wonderful thing, that they said they negotiated a deal, they wanted a lot of cash, they didn't have enough cash. So Louis said, I give you my word, we'll pay half now, let me go, and I'll send you the rest. So they did, because he was a man of his word. And he was released. And he never had to pay the other half because the vicissitudes of military intrigues being what they are, he then formed an alliance with these guys to fight other guys so that they became partners and he didn't have to pay it. But he would have paid it, and everyone knows he would have paid it. He then continued, so The major life-changing event for Louis was to understand that he was behaving in some delusional way, and his delusion had cost his kingdom an enormous loss. Many, many people were killed, and it was all because of the failure of his capacity to lead. He became a transformed person. He continued on to the Holy Land with a fraction of his army and spent the next 4 years there waging a crusade, but it was pretty enfeebled. He spent more time acting as a monk. For instance, he very famously went out to a battlefield after the battle, like a week after the battle, and buried all the dead by putting a cloth around his face. I mean, nobody else could go out there. It was too ghastly. And he dug these holes and he buried these guys. And that he acted like that's my 3 minutes. He acted like this very, very diminished individual. He spent 4 more years in the Holy Land and then received word that his mother had died and returned back to Paris and continued his kingship. Our story will not continue there. I'm going to wrap up in 12 minutes because you guys get a little break and then you have to go back to class. While he was in the Holy Land, quite surprisingly, during the time of his kingship there, he had produced under his auspices a whole variety of illuminated manuscripts, remarkable things that spoke, and I'm not going to talk about them in detail because time doesn't permit it. Some of them are of enormously high quality, some of them are of average quality, but what's important is that he was doing this. So imagine this king arrives in the Holy Land with the experience he just had. Why on earth would he or any of the others that are there, any of the other members of his court, start commissioning illuminated manuscripts? They're very expensive to produce. Yet we have a large number of them that were produced around this time, either by Louis or by other knights and members of the crusading community there. And it says something about the importance and power of these images to reflect on their experience. This one manuscript that was produced probably for the king is an Old Testament, many of the same kind of subjects that we saw in the Sainte-Chapelle. Here we see the page of the creation, where here we see God who looks like Christ creating the world in a series of days, and much like the kind of images that we have seen before. What's interesting about this object is that it is clearly derived from traditions of illumination from the West, from France, that part of his tradition, like this object, which is a Bible Louis brought with him that has much the same kind of subject matters that he brought with him, but it was made in France. But it's decorated in a way, we don't have time to go through this, sorry. Come back next year, we'll do it. It's decorated in a way that suggests what they were really interested here was creating a book that looks like, feels like it was made in the Holy Land, that was a relic itself. And these books have this power. They were made to be effectively high-quality souvenirs of this experience, relics. And because they're sacred images made in the places where these events happened, with details, and you never see this in French imagery. Look at these guys. This is the page from the story of Judith slaying Holofernes. Oh, they're really wonderful images of Muslim figures, of Eastern, even Eastern Christians. That's a level of detailed observation you just don't see in Western Europe. These books were taking on this power. There's a better detail. You would never, ever see this sort of an image in France. But the artists are making these kind of images because they have a certain authenticity to come from that place. I want to show you one other example of this. This is a page from the book of Job. Here we see Christ and Satan discussing the nature of good and evil, and they're going to test the faith of one of their citizens, and Job is the guy. And so his cattle are killed, his children are killed. A lot of bad things happen to him. Here we see he's on the dung heap lamenting his faith, and here he's seated talking to his 3 friends about the nature of his faith. These are really fabulous images of Eastern Christians or Jews. This is what people looked like in the Holy Land in the 13th century. That's the same subject, whoops, that's not it. That's the same subject made at the same time in France, where these are Jews, that's what they were, this is the Old Testament, so they're wearing the official prescribed clothing that Jews had to wear in Paris by ordinance, pointed hats. That's what Jews look like in Paris. But for Louis IX in the Holy Land, Jews look like Muslims. They look like everybody there. And there's a level of observation that goes on here that's not found in Western European images. So these books had a different power to them. What I find interesting is that you go off to the Holy Land, people are dying all around you, your resources are constrained, and you're spending money on that. Why would they do that if it wasn't really important to them? There is something about art that's right at the center of their understanding of their own experience. And that tells us this is not just church decoration. It's about something far deeper than that for them. The manuscripts have lots of complicated subjects like we've talked about. We're not going to talk about those. I will say that there were other great achievements of the Crusader kingdom, and one of them was their fortress architecture. They had to figure out a way to build fortresses in the east that allowed them to fight against Basilian Muslim soldiers. And Crac de Chevalier and other kinds of fortifications were basically cities enclosed within walls was one way to do that. Great monuments. Maybe the most original aspect of Crusader culture is their fortification architecture. Many other kinds of images were produced, again, because this issue of culture was as important as military stuff. And I'm sorry, I talked too slow and I didn't get to this other stuff. Though I will conclude with this. Back in France, at the same time the Sainte-Chapelle was being constructed, Louis also had made a manuscript, which I have a facsimile of here. If you want to take a look at it during the break, we can do this. It remains probably the most magnificent illuminated manuscript made in 13th century France. There's really a little question. It's now in the possession of the Morgan Library in New York, although it's almost never on display. It was made for the king, almost certainly, and originally it had no text. You see all around it, there are all kinds of text. We see Latin here, and this is Persian, and there's Judeo-Persian. It's all kinds of stuff here. But in the 13th century, when it was made for the king, it was just a picture book. Old Testament images. If there is no text, and everybody's dressed like a French crusader, whether you're looking at Joshua or Moses or Jacob or Louis or Robert of Artois, you could not tell because they all look the same. This picture book, therefore, transforms history from an ancient concept to a contemporary phenomenon. It takes this conceit of the power of biblical history and brings it right up to the current time by virtue of the fact that there's no way in which you could understand these images except as contemporary Crusader images because there's no text telling you anything else. You follow me there? It's exactly the same idea of the decoration of the Sainte-Chapelle. So we have here on the one hand a religious book, and on the other hand, it's really a contemporary chronicle of the Crusades. And I'm only going to do one more. This is the last image here. So here we see on the top register an image that happens to be Joshua conquering the city of Hai. But it could just as well be Louis IX and his armies riding into Damietta. They're all wearing all the clothing and all the costumes and all the military fortifications are authentic 13th century French. This is not what Joshua looked like. When the book was made, as I said, it had no text. But the image that's being depicted here, look at the upper register as I read. This is from the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. This is the scene that's being depicted on the upper register. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Stretch out the sword that is in your hand toward Hai." And you see here the sword? The power of this image is important. "For I will give it into your hand." And Joshua stretched out the sword that was in his hand toward the city. When Israel had finished slaughtering all the inhabitants of Hai in the open wilderness where they had pursued them, and when all of them to the very last had fallen by the edge of the sword, all Israel returned to Hai and attacked it with the edge of the sword. The total of those who fell that day, both men and women, was 12,000, all of the people of Hai. For Joshua did not draw back his hand, with which he stretched out the sword, until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Hai. And he hanged the king of Hai on a tree until evening. This is an image of that moment as described in the Old Testament. But once again, without the recourse to this text, it's a Crusader image, absolutely, and completely consistent with the kind of texts that were being written at that time. Now, fast forward a little bit. By about 1300, 50 years after this manuscript was made, Louis IX dies on his second crusade in 1270. He takes off, and in Tunis he gets dysentery, and he never makes it to the Holy Land, and he's done. By 1300, this manuscript finds its way to southern Italy, where this Latin inscriptions were added to describe the scenes. People weren't comfortable with a picture book without a text. They wanted to know what they're looking at. It's not enough that it's beautiful or complicated. I want to know exactly what I'm looking at. So this Latin was put up. Fast forward 300 years The life of an object is fascinating. In 1604, emissaries from the Vatican, the same guys, Urban II, same place, they're on their way to Persia to see Shah Abbas the Great, the most powerful leader in ancient medieval Persia, to negotiate a peace treaty with him. And they bring this book as a gift, because you always bring gifts when you're trying to get somebody's attention and show them you mean business. So they bring this book, the emissaries, to give Shah Abbas this magnificent Illuminated Old Testament, which has at the time Latin inscriptions. And he looks at it and he says, very nice, I like it, it's good. I don't read that. So he calls some of his scholars over and he says, sit with these emissaries, give me some captions, because I don't know what that says. And I want to show you how this game is played. So let me just say, so I read to you the biblical passage. Here's what the Latin says first. How, when God, now well disposed towards all the people of Israel, after the punishment of one family, had commanded Joshua to set ambushes and attack the city. He obeyed, took the city, having killed all, hanged the king himself on a pole. Pretty terse, to the point. That's what we're looking at here. That's it. So now Shah Abbas's guys are going to write in Persian. What are we looking at here? And this is what they decided to write. After seizing the sinner, they went and conquered that city and hanged the king of that city, and the realm became theirs. Not a lot of detail. That's what it says. About 50 years after that, somehow, we don't know how, this manuscript found its way into the collection of a Jew, a wealthy Jew. And he had inscriptions added in Judeo-Persian. This was somebody living in that empire who had resources. So he had his guys add inscriptions, because I don't read these things. I want it to tell me what's what. So the scholars that he had do this. And by the way, when I did this facsimile, we did a book about this book. I wrote about it about 10 years ago. Those inscriptions had never been translated. We found there's like one scholar of Judeo-Persian on the planet. We hired her to read these things and translate them. And everybody couldn't wait, because finally we'll open up the meaning of these great texts from antiquity. So the great text this is what it says in Judeo-Persian. This is a town which the children of Israel conquered, hanged its king, and became masters of the town. I don't know where this is. So, 400 years of waiting to see what it says, that's what we get. The book then eventually found its way into the marketplace and was owned by a collector in London. And just before the First World War, it was offered for sale to J.P. Morgan. And his librarian, they did not know it was a Louis IX manuscript. They just knew it was very pretty. And it was, I don't know, 14,000 pounds or something. And so Pierpont Morgan, who bought everything he could find, said, too expensive, don't buy it. He died. His son, J.P. Morgan, came along, Pierpont Morgan, whatever, the son. Same librarian. It was offered up for sale right after the First World War. She didn't even ask him. She just bought it. And she said, I bought it, and it's part of the collection. It became the most treasured object in his collection. He had the first facsimile of it made right after that, and it has been the great treasure of their collection ever since. I was invited about 10 years ago to participate in the production of a complete, perfect facsimile of that manuscript, which is what I have in my hand. And all the pages are here with the text. All the pages are illuminated in gold, just as they were. And if you would like, during the break, to take a look at it, please feel free to do so. Thank you all. You've been a great group, and time for a break.